We're here with Professor Steve Wermiel, co-author of a new book just out on the first Monday of October, with Justice Brennan, Liberal Champion. And
here's a copy.
Here's a copy. A long time in the making. It is the authoritative biography of the Justice, and Professor Wermiel had unequaled access to the Justice and to many of his papers. And let's start with if you could tell us a little bit about the process, how the book came about, and really what you were able to dive into.
The book was facilitated by actually someone who's been a very good friend to the American Constitution Society, Judge Abner Mikva, former Chief Judge of the U.S. Court of Appeals in D.C. He was a good friend of mine when I was covering the Supreme Court for the Wall Street Journal, and he also was a good friend of Justice Brennan's. And he had the sense that Justice Brennan was looking to cooperate with a biography as Brennan hit his 80th birthday and 30th year on the court. And I was in the right place at the right time and hit it off with Justice Brennan, and so kind of jumped in. Carefully at first. I mean, I got a tape recorder, and he was 80 years old, and I didn't know how much longer he'd be with us, and so I just started saying, let's meet as often as we can and asking him questions. But then over time, I'd sort of gradually say, well, can I look at the case files? And was somewhat surprised that the answer was sure, help yourself. And then I would over time say, well, can I look at the narrative histories, these kind of famous accounts of what went on in the court terms that his law clerks wrote with him? And he said, sure. So it got to a point where, to my amazement, I could knock on the door and actually walk into his chambers and say, Justice, I want to get one of the histories out of the desk drawer. They were in the bottom right-hand drawer of his desk, and he'd say, yeah, help yourself. And I'd walk over and open the drawer and pull one out and go sit down in the other room and read. And I was pretty much left alone. I had the opportunity to see current court decisions circulating and sitting on people's desks, but I understood that I was there in my capacity as the biographer, and that what I was seeing was not for my own use or consumption, that I had to keep the secrets of the chambers, and it certainly was worth it. I mean, if you imagine that you had the opportunity to do a job right about the Supreme Court for 7 or 8 years, and then somebody came to you and said, and now, after 7 or 8 years, you're going to get a tutorial from the inside from one of the great masters of this institution you've been writing about. It was a remarkable thing. He let me come and sit in with him as he met with the law clerks. He let me sit in with him as he prepared for oral argument. A case would be assigned to a clerk, but all 4 clerks would come in together and argue about that case with him, and he'd ask questions that were on his mind, and they would raise questions with him about his position and how it might play with other justices, and you could sort of see the wheels turning in just a fascinating way. In one sense, and maybe the last point about this is, there's an old one of the Supreme Court Historical Society's tapes about the court, where Justice Breyer says the story about the Supreme Court is that there's no story, and I always hated that line when he said it. But in a sense, it's true that what I got to see was thoughtful deliberation at work, not wild-eyed, frenzied, living Constitution debate, but genuine, serious discussion about the cases and how they should go.
At the event at the Supreme Court that ACS hosted with you and an illustrious panel, there was a lot of discussion about just sort of what you were alluding to, which is this ongoing debate and sort of decisions and how they are reached between liberals and conservatives. There was talk about clerks who are clones of the justices they worked for. And Justice Brennan really was atypical, at least for now, and back then as well, probably a little too, in that he hired not just clerks in his own ideological image. So he was very secure in that. What was he? Did you experience any of that? What he was sort of looking for in those discussions?
Well, I mean, it was a different time. The Warren Court, the Berger Court were and the Rehnquist Court were as liberal and conservative as any court, but I think they all liked each other genuinely. They got along with each other genuinely. I think they still do, actually, but we have the sense of the court being much more deeply polarized and divided. I don't think Brennan would have liked that. He liked his colleagues. I recalled at the Supreme Court event a moment when he was talking to me about a deeply conservative Rehnquist majority opinion, and he talked about it with the most amazing admiration for what a good job Rehnquist had done with this opinion. And I remember very vividly Justice Brennan saying, I said something about the opinion, and wasn't that surprising that Rehnquist got a majority for that, and how far it went? And Brennan said, yes, and wasn't it marvelous? I mean, he liked his colleagues, he respected his colleagues. At the end of the day, they needed to be able to continue to work together and get along with each other, and so the law clerks coming from different backgrounds was a reflection of that. The law clerks were there to do a quality job and not to write their own more liberal or more conservative views into Justice Brennan's jurisprudence. He had some very conservative law clerks, although I think they were not as conservative when they were clerks as they became later. Richard Posner was not Richard Posner of today when he was a law clerk, although Brennan still to this day says was the smartest clerk he ever had. Michael Chertoff, who later became judge on the Third Circuit and then Secretary of Homeland Security, I think was probably not as conservative as a law clerk as he is today. The one who I think probably was as conservative as a law clerk as he is now is Michael McConnell, who became a judge on the 10th Circuit Court of Appeals and then left to go run a constitutional law center at Stanford Law School. And I suspect McConnell was closer to what he really is now as a law clerk. But, Brennan picked the law clerks partly from the feeder judges. The Court of Appeals judges recommended the clerks to him, and they weren't necessarily doing the kind of ideological screening that goes on today. The famous story, which Brennan inherited, was that Judge Skelly Wright of the D.C. Circuit would call the winner of the election to be editor of the Harvard Law Review the night of the election and say, I want you to clerk for me. And, you had till the next morning to accept his offer. But then he'd call Brennan and say, I've got the editor of the Harvard Law Review, will you take him next year? Well, Brennan didn't know whether they were liberal or conservative. He just knew that they were going to clerk for Skelly Wright.